Shalom, everybody. How to trigger a leftist, sit in a Hobby Lobby parking lot and make a video about patriarchy. So, start by doing this, since it's about the subject. Take my hat off, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Why I did that, but I wanna deal with 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I know, big surprise, right? 1 Corinthians 11. I don't know if we've done a video yet without referencing 1 Corinthians 11, specifically verse number 3. But I want to deal with actually the entire passage today, and specifically the topic of head coverings. And when I say head coverings, I mean the literal, physical covering that a woman should have on her head and a man should not have on his head while praying and prophesying. So I do believe that in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is specifically referring to something different than just the hair. I know he mentions hair, and we can get into a long discussion and debate about hair versus hat or cloth covering, or whatever your understanding of covering is. But I firmly believe that he is not simply talking about the hair, that he's talking about something more specific, a hat, a scarf of some sort, something that's clearly intended for the purpose of a covering. So I want to talk about that and what I think our application should be as believers. And I want to talk about specifically verse number 10, where Paul says that the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. I want to talk about that. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to give a couple of testimonials from my family, my wife, and a couple of other men's wives that I know, and I want to talk about that and some application from Matthew chapter 24, I believe it is. So for starters, I'm just going to be straight up with you. I believe that if a man is wearing something on his head, like that hat I just took off, while he's praying or prophesying, that he's dishonoring Messiah, because Messiah is his head, as is clearly laid out in 1 Corinthians 11. I think if a woman is praying or prophesying without having a covering on her head, a hat or a scarf or whatever, her husband approves as a covering, then that woman is dishonoring her head, which is her husband. I believe that's what Paul is saying here. Am I going to say that it's a sin? No, I'm not, because I can't find it in the Torah. And we all know the definition of sin is transgression of the Torah. Now, I do see a lot of principles in the Torah that indicate about covering, and Paul even references the one about the woman whose head, her hair or her covering is loosed for the purpose of the adultery test. So the principle is certainly there, but there is not a thou shalt or thou shalt not. So what I will say is the same thing Paul says. It's dishonoring. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to dishonor my Messiah, and I don't want my woman dishonoring me. So that's what I believe our application should be, is literally what it says. I think that we ought to be. Now, I actually take it a little bit further than what it says. The reason I removed my hat, right, I did that on purpose for this video because it applies, but I actually don't normally wear hats at all. But the reason I removed my hat is I think anytime that a man is handling scripture, anytime he's doing any sort of teaching or anything related to scripture or spiritual matters, I just think it's best practice to not have something on his head. Does Paul specifically say that? No, he doesn't. So I fully admit that that's my own personal opinion and my personal application. I highly recommend it, though. And when we get to this testimonials later, you'll see why I'm highly recommending that folks follow the same rough outline for how to practice this. I think women ought to be having something on their head anytime they're dealing with any sort of spiritual matter. And I'll even go so far as to say I think it's a good idea for a married woman, and I do believe it applies to married women. I don't personally think this applies to unmarried. I think once she's betrothed, right? Once the agreement is made, whether she's actually been taken physically or not, once the agreement is made, she is now under the authority of a man other than her father. She should have her head covered. And I actually think she should have her head covered pretty much all the time, especially when she's interacting with other men who are not family. That's my recommendation, and that's my personal application, is how I handle it in my family. Again, I don't find a thou shalt or thou shalt not in the Torah, so I'm not going to say that a woman is sinning or a man is sinning by not having his woman do that. But that's my application, and I feel like it's a good one, and there's a multitude of reasons why. So, I'll let y'all read 1 Corinthians 11 for yourself. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but specifically, there's 2 heads mentioned, right, for each individual. For the man, it's literally his physical head that's not supposed to be covered during praying and prophesying, and it's his spiritual head, his authority, which is Messiah. For the woman, there's, again, her physical head, which is supposed to be covered during praying and prophesying, and then there's her authority, her spiritual head, which is her man, her husband. So that's that's specifically what Paul is saying here, and as stated before, that's my understanding of how we should be applying that. Now, I'm going to go specifically to 1 Corinthians 11, verse number 10, and I read that a minute ago. I'm going to read it again. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, it's important for me to point out, I'm reading from New American Standard. It's important for me to point out that the words "a symbol of" in the middle of that verse are in italics, which means they are added by the translators for the purpose of clarity. I'll say that most of the time, the italicized words added for clarity are accurate based on the evaluation that I've done as I read through the New American Standard. I'm not saying that for necessarily any other translation. New American Standard is the one I'm the most studied in. Most of the time, they are accurate. Not always. I do believe this is a time when it is accurate. I think that symbol is literally the cloth head covering or hat, or again, whatever her husband approves as being her head covering, but it's not her hair, just so we're clear, in my opinion. That's the symbol that's being spoken about in verse number 10. The because of the angels part, right? The last phrase of that verse is the part that I often puzzled over for a long time, since beginning to even study the head covering issue back when I was still in the Independent Baptist Church. And I always wondered what does the because of the angels part mean? And I had a couple of theories that I floated and tested, and they didn't really hold water. Well, the one that I think I've concluded, and again, I'm going to give some testimonials at the end of this video that will, I think, confirm it. But the one that I think is, and by the way, I didn't come to this conclusion on my own. I consulted with other men, studied, in depth, found some information online. So I'm not claiming to, have come up with some new doctrine or anything of that nature. And I wouldn't even necessarily call this doctrine. Well, I guess doctrine means truth, so I do believe it's true. So I guess that is. But I think what he's saying here is that it's a symbol, and this was probably pretty well known to people at the time, which is why he didn't clarify this. That's again my thinking here. This was probably pretty well known, but I think that symbol is something that the spiritual realm recognizes. I think both evil spirits and clean spirits, unclean spirits and messengers of our Elohim, messengers of Yahweh. And I think that they recognize that symbol, and they recognize that that is the symbol of a woman who is under submission. She's under the authority of a man, and it's a protection for her. It's a place of protection for her. They don't have access to her without her authority's approval. And by the way, the same applies for men, right? With us not having something on our head because we're being obedient to these principles that Paul is talking about here, it's symbolic to the spiritual realm, right? That we are submitted to Messiah. And these are basic principles of hierarchy. They're principles of the authority structure that Yahweh established from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. And yes, I do believe patriarchy was present in the Garden of Eden. That's a whole other video that we can deal with later. But the point is, we're being obedient to the best of our ability, to the best of our understanding, and that is evident to the spiritual realm because our men are going without a head covering. Our women are going with a head covering. And that communication to the spiritual realm is a place of protection. I think even more specifically, what Paul is talking about here is it's a place of protection for the woman. And all right, I'm going to give the testimonials next, and then I'm going to add one more thing to the end of this video, and I better make a note of it so I don't forget. My wife let me start here. My wife doesn't have any hair. She has lost her hair as a result of some health issues. She actually hasn't had hair for a number of years now. And so as a result of that, she always wears something on her head. Which actually, you know what, let me back up to my application. My wife, even if she had hair, she would pretty much always have something on her head anyway, because other than being around family members, I don't think it's a good idea for a married woman to be in the presence of another man without her head covered, without that symbol that she's under authority. Because I realize our culture is not this way, but the culture we're trying to get back to, that head covering is symbolic of the woman being taken. The woman is married. She's under the authority of a husband. And so for that reason, I think other than family, women should have their head covered anytime they're around other men. So that's my application. Again, personal application, and I do believe it's a cultural application, and it's a culture that we're trying to as a community reconstitute. We're trying to actually get that culture back in our community. So there you go. Now, like I said, my wife doesn't have any hair at all, and she lost her hair as a result of health issues. She hasn't had hair for quite a while, for several years now. And she as a result always wears something on her head. Pretty much, other than when she's showering, she has something on her head. At night, when she goes to sleep, she wears what's called a chemo cap, and her health issues were not cancer, so it's not chemotherapy related. it's different health issues that cause her to lose her hair. But she wears what's called a chemo cap, and it's basically a cotton cap with an elastic band around it that just kind of holds it tight and keeps it on her head. And that cap, one night, about 5-6 weeks ago, somewhere in that range, I can't remember specifically, but that cap fell off of her head. And she didn't know it, right? It was while she was sleeping is when it fell off. And that night, she had a nightmare. And in that nightmare, I'm not going to go through all the details of the nightmare, but the short story is she heard some a significant amount of demonic voices. Didn't even necessarily understand what they were saying, but there was these demonic voices, and they were scaring her quite a bit, scared her to the point where it woke her up. And when she woke up, she realized that her hat had come off her head, her cap had come off her head, and knowing my understanding of this passage and of what Paul was teaching, and me having taught that to her and instructed her to apply it that way and all of that, she immediately grabbed her cap and put it back on her head. Went back to sleep without any issue and slept through the rest of the night with no problems. Completely peaceful. The next day, she told me that story about the dream she had, the nightmare she had, and she told me all about that. And I personally took that as a confirmation for my understanding of this passage. And not only my understanding, there's other men who have the same understanding. Well, we, I don't know, 3 weeks later, something like that, we told some friends of ours about this experience. And I think I had previously presented my understanding of this passage to them. But even if I hadn't, we presented it at that point, roughly 3 weeks after this nightmare that my wife had. And the following week, the wife of, well, the friend, my wife's friend, it's a married couple. She started having some nightmares, and so she decided, I'm going to test this out. And so she started wearing head covering while she was sleeping, and for a week she went back and forth, where some nights she wore it and some nights she did not. And there was an exact correlation. Every night that she wore the head covering, she slept peacefully during that week. Every night that she did not wear it, she had a nightmare. And again, demonic nightmares. So again, yet another confirmation. And that confirmation was specifically, intentionally tested. Well, then about a week ago, maybe a week and a half, something like that, my wife told me that she had another dream. And when she woke up from that dream, she realized that her cap was not on her head. And this dream, she said, was not really a nightmare. However, in the dream, there were certainly some disturbing things that happened. Part of the dream, our 2-year-old son, was drowning, and my wife had to save him. And she was successful in the dream. She was successful in saving him. But either way, that's a scary thing, right? Dreams can feel exceptionally real. So then, I was telling this story yesterday, actually, to another friend of mine over the phone, and I explained this to him, and he started asking me questions, and he said, was this about 5 weeks ago? I said yes, and I told him then again, I don't remember specifically. It might have been 6 or 7 weeks, but it was approximately 5 weeks ago. And he said, about 5 weeks ago, my wife started having nightmares. That's what he said. And this gentleman lives in a completely different part of the country. We don't talk a lot. In fact, it had been a while since we had spoken directly before yesterday. So what conclusions can I reach from this? Well, first of all, there's a lot of correlation here. Doesn't necessarily, I fully admit that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, right? It doesn't mean it causes things to happen. However, that's an awful lot of coincidence, right? And I don't really believe in coincidences. So, that takes me to Matthew 24. And specifically in Matthew 24, let me get there, I'm sorry. Verse 37. In fact, I'm going to back up. I'm going to start reading in verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. So I want to back up to the second verse I read. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. What happened in the days of Noah with regards to women? And I know this is a controversial thing, but I fully believe that what's talked about in Genesis is what's talked about in the book of Enoch. And I fully believe that you had a situation where you had unclean spirits, corrupt angels, whatever classification you want to put them in, fallen angels who came to earth and they took human women and created offspring with them. They mated with them, and their offspring were the Nephilim. Their offspring were the giants that we read about. Well, what does that symbol mean? What protection is that head covering giving? I think it's giving protection from those unclean spirits. Now, does that mean that am I claiming that if women don't start wearing head coverings all the time, that angels are going to come down and start having sex with them? I'm not saying that. I'm not making that claim. But I do think that the spiritual attacks are heightening. And I think that our women are the most vulnerable to those spiritual attacks. I think our women need to be fully submitted to their husbands. And I think that needs to include them wearing a head covering. I think men, we need to be fully submitted to Messiah. And I think that needs to include us not having our head covered when we're handling spiritual matters. That's where we're at. That's where I stand. That's my take on this whole issue. And I want to address one more thing, which is a bit of an elephant in the room, and that is Judaism. I believe that Judah is my brother. I believe I am part of House of Israel, Ephraim, and Judah is my brother. I believe that the reforms that need to happen in Judaism are primarily that they need to recognize that Yeshua is Messiah. I believe that just like the modern church has a whole host of traditions and doctrines that are not rooted in Scripture, so does Judaism. And one of those traditions that Judaism has is the men wearing the kippah. And I think I'm fine with men wearing a kippah. I'm not fine with them keeping it on when they're handling spiritual matters. They need to be removing it at a minimum for praying and prophesying. Many in our movement and I know one personally, a man personally, and a couple of them that I've met only one time, but I'm friends with, that they do wear things on their head. And in fact, they don't normally wear things on their head, but some of them I know, they specifically put something on their head when they're attending a Sabbath meeting and when they know there's going to be spiritual matters being dealt with and praying and all of those things. And I think they're getting a lot of those traditions from Judaism. And don't get me wrong, Judaism has a lot of beautiful traditions, right? That's not one of them. In my opinion, anyone who believes Yeshua and believes that Paul, is a legitimate teacher, I think you're by ignoring what he says here in 1 Corinthians 11 with regards to the physical head covering and continuing to do that, I think you're basically making the claim that you or someone that you learn from knows more than Paul does. And to me, that's arrogant. Paul, I don't think he's unclear. We can debate whether or not the covering for the woman is her hair, right? Again, I don't think there's really a debate to be had there. But one thing that there's no question, he's not telling a man to add a covering to his head. There's no way he's saying that. And he's specifically saying that if a man keeps a covering on his head while praying and prophesying, that he's dishonoring his head. And his head is Messiah. Men, we shouldn't be doing anything to dishonor Messiah. And we should be embracing the authority structure that's laid out here, that's specifically explained here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 3. And that's Yahweh, Messiah, man, woman. Notice that I did not say Yahweh, Messiah, pastor, man, woman. Notice I did not say Yahweh, Messiah, rabbi, man, woman. A rabbi, a pastor, of whatever name you want to give him, does not have authority in your life. His authority, if he has any, is limited to dealings of the specific church or ecclesia or assembly or kahal, whatever word you want to apply to your gathering. That's where his authority is limited to. So, men, step up. Be a man. Read the scriptures and apply it for yourself and in your household. Be the man that you're called to be. And take those hats and kippas and whatever else you might be wearing on your head. You want to wear it any other time, fine. That's great. I know lots of men who wear hats all the time. Take it off when you're praying. Take it off when you're handling things, spiritual matters. When you're handling scripture, when you're praying, when you're dealing with things with regards to scripture, with regards to your authority in your home, take the hat off. It's many people will say, well, I don't want to be offensive to my brother Judah. And you know what? I don't want to be either. But I'm more concerned about dishonoring my Messiah than I am about offending a tradition that is not rooted in Scripture. So, there you go. I know this is going to be an unpopular video for a lot of people, but that's my take on it. And yeah, I've said enough. So, shalom, y'all.